My experience of the Panama Canal, an engineering marvel that is one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, began early with a 6 a.m. wake-up call on the Viking Neptune on October 17th of this year. It was a colorful sunrise as we were anchored outside Colón, Panama, in the Limon Bay, along with the 34 other ships waiting their scheduled turns to enter the canal. Viking had paid $250,000 to the Panamanian Canal Authority for our expedited crossing. It would take 8 hours from the Atlantic Ocean entrance at Colón to sail the 50 miles due south through the Continental Divide and exit into the Pacific Ocean at Panama City. We had made the land journey from Colón to Panama City across the isthmus by bus the previous day and observed the difference between the two cities. Colón, with its history of trade and piracy, is still rather dark and grimy, even with its modern port, where indigenous people, descendants of the Embera, sell baskets woven by their grandmothers. We only caught glimpses of life in this city and the surrounding country, which has served as the starting point for travelers from around the world. So many have passed through, but few stay for long. Today's modern highway ride of an hour took Balboa and his party of 190 Spaniards weeks in 1513 to hack through the dense jungle and cross the mighty Chagres River and catch a glimpse of the Pacific. In contrast, Panama City dazzles with its skyscrapers and sparkling seaside resorts, where we enjoyed a walking tour of its historic Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There were plazas, a cathedral, its grand hotel, shops, and a pleasant respite at Casablanca's outside tables for a taste of tuna tartare, and of course the opportunity to buy more local crafts from indigenous people. Today, there would be no port stops. Rather, a day of rising through the first set of 3 locks to the Gatun Lake, across its wide expanse into river-like channels, through the narrow Culebra Cut, into the Pedro Miguel Lock, then the 2 Miraflores locks, past Panama City, and finally out into the lower Pacific Ocean. As we slowly moved forward under the impressive Atlantic Bridge, we could see on the right side a glimpse of the original sea-level canal, attempted and later abandoned by the French in the late 1800s. It brought to mind a costly and sad story for one dreamer of such a sailing, Ferdinand de Lesseps. Most of the 750 passengers on the Viking Neptune were assembled in the Explorer's Lounge, fortified with pastries and coffee, to witness the entrance to the first locks. On the packed front deck, J.B. could see over some of the people, but I had to find a Zacchaeus-like perch to get my photographs and videos to share with you. As we waited, birds soared in the blue skies above the lush green foliage on a perfect day in the middle of what was the rainy season. Anticipation was high. At precisely 8 a.m., the immense steel doors of the Gatun locks slowly swung open, and a pilot boat guided our ship between the thick concrete walls as it squeezed into the first chamber. Trolley-like trains called mulas were connected by steel cables to the ship and moved along beside us on tracks to keep the ship centered and prevent it from bumping against the concrete sides. Two men in a tiny rowboat threw the ropes out to men on the ship who attached the cables. It was an old-fashioned process. The gates closed behind us, and the chamber filled with water supplied by Gatun Lake. In about 20 minutes, we were lifted 30 feet to the top of the first chamber. The operation of each flight of locks was run from the second floor of a large control house built on the center wall of the uppermost lock. From there, an unobstructed view of the entire flight gave one man at one control board the ability to run every operation in the passage of the ship. Water and gravity did all the work to raise the ship. The walls, 1,000 feet long, higher than a 6-story building, and the gate leaves from 47 to 85 feet tall and weighing up to 745 tons, work as precisely as a Swiss watch. They are truly one of the engineering triumphs of all time. Over the next 2 hours, this process was repeated for each of the 3 Gatun locks, requiring 52 million gallons of water per ship for the full 90-minute rise. Our Viking lecturer gave lots of factual and historical information at the front, too much detail to remember or to try to share. As we left the third of the locks, we could see the Gatun Dam off on the right side as we entered the Gatun Lake. Once out into the Gatun Lake at a water level of 86 feet, we had about 3 hours of smooth, clear sailing through a shimmering expanse of blue water, so pure that it kills barnacles on a ship's bottom. Dotted with jungle-draped islands, it provided time for visiting with new friends in the Explorer's Lounge, and more coffee, and a rare donut for me. This Gatun Lake had been created specifically for supplying the water for the canal by damming up the Chargers River. Several villages had been flooded, and many people lost their homes and land. I had read the moving story of Valentina, an indigenous woman who had the courage to lead protests, including a sit-down strike, to try to save her ancestral home, to no avail. She had been forced to move to Panama City, where her husband sold fish in the market. Thinking about her story deepened the experience as I took photos of the lovely serene lake from our windy front deck. Finally, the channel narrowed through a series of named turns. The entire route was bordered by the same kind of jungle wilderness that had confronted the first surveyors. We passed Gamboa, a small village and destination for tourists where dredging operations for the canal are based. During the 10 years of U.S. construction, it was where many of the workers lived. Over 40,000 people from all over the world were employed on the project. Engineers, administrators, skilled tradesmen, machinery operators, doctors, nurses, cooks, maids, many from the U.S., but most were unskilled laborers from the West Indies islands, especially Barbados. They lived in barracks and shopped in commissaries, using a currency system of gold for whites and silver for other, or people of color. Life was very different between these two levels. I thought of the stories of Ada Bunton, the 16-year-old from Barbados who came and worked as a maid to send money home for the medical care for her sister, and of John and Marion Osborne, a doctor and his wife from Tennessee who came to defeat malaria, and their story ended in tragedy. We relaxed with a pleasant lunch in the restaurant with chilled Chardonnay before we entered the 8-mile Culebra Cut with its wide-angled chiseled stone walls. As we glided along with such ease through this deep trough that passed through the Continental Divide, I reflected on descriptions of the years of human toil and challenges of digging through the steep mountains, and mental images mingled with the scenery. Workers laboring in temperatures of 100 degrees or more, swinging their picks into the rocks, the constant sound of drills, the mammoth steam shovels, the dangers of dynamite as they lowered the floor of the excavation to within 40 feet of sea level, the daily break to swallow the required malaria pills for prevention, the mudslides in the rainy season. Even with precautions, accidents and disease claimed the lives of 5,609 workers. Time to process these stories was limited as we crossed under the Centennial Bridge, which carries traffic of the Pan American Highway across Panama. Soon we were entering the Pedro Miguel lock, which would lower our ship 30 feet. We moved to the back deck and focused on the mulas attached to the rear of the ship. Again, we were fascinated with the workings of the locks and trying to capture the lowering of the water and the ship along the concrete walls. I wondered about the stories the workers walking along the top of the walls or sitting in the control towers might tell. We went up to our portside stateroom balcony as we sailed quietly at an elevation of 52 feet above sea level in the Miraflores Lake, through a channel which seemed like a peaceful European river cruise. Sooner than expected, we could see the skyscrapers of Panama City, through which we had driven the previous day. In the distance, we caught a glimpse of the administration building. Soon we began to hear loud cheering as we approached the final two-stepped Miraflores locks, which would lower us back to sea level. From the balcony of our stateroom, we waved to the crowds gathered in the viewing stands at the end of the Miraflores locks. For tourists not fortunate enough to sail through the canal, there was this opportunity to witness ships passing through, observe the workings of the locks, and share some personal interaction with people making this landmark passage. It was a rather thrilling mutual experience that lasted for almost 5 minutes. What stories might these people tell to their children and grandchildren about seeing the Viking Neptune pass by? It was about 3:30 in the afternoon as we approached the Bridge of the Americas, marking the exit. We could clearly recognize the buildings of Panama City by which we had driven the previous day. This time, we simply admired the cityscape and tried to absorb the journey we were completing. By 4 p.m., we were out into the mouth of the Pacific Ocean. back at sea level after having been hoisted up about 90 feet and lowered back down by the locks over the 8-hour sailing. Sea level is sea level, but the coast at Panama City is a few feet higher than the Atlantic coast entrance at Colón. My experience of this journey through the Panama Canal was enriched by the stories of those past lives who had been important to and impacted by the canal. As described by David McCullough in his book, The Path Between the Seas, Christina Enriquez in her novel, The Great Divide, John le Carré in his spy novel, The Tailor of Panama, a guest lecturer on our cruise, Corey Sandler, from his PowerPoint presentations and endless information and images from the internet. A story from Christina Enriquez's book, The Great Divide, flashed into my mind. We were sailing where Francisco Aquino, the Panamanian fisherman, sat in his boat and looked over the horizon where the ships would exit and resented the disruption of his way of life by the Americans. And I quote, Francisco folded his fingers into fists and sighed. The ocean spread endlessly around him, glittering in the early sun. In the quiet, his little boat listed and swayed. His eyesight, unfortunately, was not what it used to be. Francisco squinted out at the horizon to the place where supposedly ships 100 times bigger than his little boat would someday line up, wait their turn to sail across Panama. He sputtered a laugh. It was a ludicrous idea, impossible to believe. Every sailor and explorer who had landed on these shores had dreamed that ships would one day travel from ocean to ocean by way of Panama, although exactly how they expected to get from one side to the other was anyone's guess. The spine of the great Cordillera Mountains running straight through the isthmus stood in the way, and many of the miraculous things Francis had heard in his life, he had never heard of a ship that could sail through a mountain. So they would cut the mountains, they said, breaking the spine, and once that was done, the water from both oceans would gust forth and join to create a pathway through. A delusional dream, putting not one but two oceans in a place where for millions of years there had only been land. Who could believe such a thing? Francisco lifted the brim of his hat and squinted harder, trying to see the phantom shapes of steamers and schooners and battleships and boats, all the vessels that they swore would come through. He looked, but instead of ships, all he could see sitting on top of the water was the brilliant blue sky. Perhaps the problem, he thought, was that a person needed faith to be able to see things that did not exist, to imagine a world not yet made. In addition to so many other things, Francisco had lost his faith a long time ago. After a lovely pink cloud sunset, we enjoyed a quiet dinner on our balcony. The rise of a full moon over the calm Pacific inspired further reflection on the storied history that made today's experience so interesting to me. If Francisco Aquino, the fictional Panamanian fisherman, might have lost his vision and faith in the early 1900s, Theodore Roosevelt, who inspired and negotiated the U.S. deals for the canal, articulated his case with great clarity and certainty. We must build the canal in Panama and have our say in deciding the destiny of the oceans of the East and West. To him, the canal was the vital, indispensable path to a global destiny for the U.S., a first step to American supremacy at sea. He spun his story, led the charge, and actually played with the big toys on a visit to the site. However, he never returned to cross through the waterway that he dreamed of. The official grand opening of the canal on August 15, 1914, was performed with little fanfare by the SS Ancon, a small ship with only a few dignitaries on its bow. The chief engineer for the project, George W. Goethals, was not one of them, but rather traveled ahead by rail car to make sure everything went smoothly at each lock. According to John Barrett, one of the passengers, the Ancon left Gatun at 7 a.m. and proceeded so quietly that a strange observer coming suddenly upon the scene would have thought that the canal had always been in operation, and that the Ancon was only doing what thousands of other vessels must have done before. The Ancon steamed from the Atlantic to the Pacific in roughly 9 hours, which still holds as the average transit time. The canal began operation as smoothly as it would for over a century to come, as smoothly as it did on October 17, 2024, the day we sailed through on the Viking Neptune. To quote David McCullough, the creation of a water passage across Panama was one of the supreme human achievements of all time, the culmination of a heroic dream of 400 years and of more than 20 years of phenomenal effort and sacrifice. The 50 miles between the oceans were among the hardest ever won by human effort and ingenuity, and no statistics on tonnage or tolls can begin to convey the grandeur of what was accomplished. Primarily, the canal is an expression of that old and noble desire to bridge the divide, to bring people together. It is a work of civilization.